because there was a lot of heartbreak, and in my life, I felt very heartbroken.
Yeah.
And I saw a lot of things that people didn't seem to see.
Yes.
Being sensitive, you know?
Yeah.
It's hard to talk about, huh? As much as one would like to get out of a tunnel of grief, it's not possible. You're there. It's really, you know, when you think back, he's humble, you know, and he's full of joy and very humorous. Good evening.
Good evening.
She paused. It wasn't a dramatic pause. No sharp intake of breath. No instinctive sense that something was wrong. Just a pause, long enough to register, short enough to ignore. At the time, it felt harmless. Later, it would feel permanent. If you care about the real stories behind the music, subscribe to RetroWaves. This channel is built for that. She told herself she would come back to it, not because she didn't want to talk, not because she felt distant, but because she believed the moment wasn't urgent. She believed there would be time. That belief didn't feel careless. It felt reasonable. Annie Lennox had lived long enough to know that most things people call urgent aren't. Deadlines move, crises soften, conversations repeat themselves. So she let this one wait. What she didn't know, and wouldn't fully understand until years later, was that the most important moments rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive with urgency, they don't feel final. They pass quietly, disguised as ordinary pauses. And by the time they reveal what they were, they're already out of reach. Annie had spent her life around people who burned intensely, artists who lived loudly, who collapsed publicly, who demanded attention when something was wrong. George Michael wasn't like that. He didn't explode. He receded. Their connection had never been loud. They weren't inseparable. They weren't constantly photographed together. They didn't rely on each other publicly. What they shared was subtler than that. A recognition. Two people who understood what it meant to be admired and misunderstood at the same time. Two voices shaped by restraint rather than excess. Two artists who knew how dangerous silence could be, and still chose it. They didn't need constant reassurance from one another, and sometimes that made distance feel safe. George had learned how to disappear without leaving. He still showed up, still fulfilled obligations, still spoke when spoken to, but there were stretches where something shifted. Not enough for headlines, not enough for concern, just enough for someone paying attention to feel it. Annie felt it. She just didn't know what to call it yet. There were moments when she considered reaching out more directly. Moments when she thought about asking questions she didn't already know the answers to. Then she would stop herself, because George valued control, and Annie had always respected that. She believed that if he wanted to speak, he would. She believed that silence was something he chose, not something imposed on him. That belief felt respectful at the time. Years later, Annie would speak differently about silence. She would describe how easily it can be mistaken for strength, how often people assume quiet means coping, how dangerous it is to confuse composure with safety. She didn't say these things about George specifically, but the timing of those reflections was not accidental. George Michael had survived everything the world thought should have broken him. Public scrutiny, legal battles, humiliation turned into spectacle. Each time he emerged composed, careful, controlled. That survival became part of his identity, even to the people who knew him, even to Annie. But survival has a way of lying to those watching. It convinces them that endurance equals resilience, that if someone has survived before, they will always survive again. George was very good at giving that impression. Too good. Annie remembered small details later, moments that hadn't stood out at the time. A hesitation where there used to be ease. A distance that felt polite rather than protective. A tone that suggested effort rather than comfort. At the time, she didn't label these things. She folded them away. And what you fold away doesn't disappear. It waits. She believed that if something truly mattered, it would insist on being addressed. That pain would make itself known. that urgency would rise to the surface. What she hadn't learned yet was that some people don't ask for help, not because they don't need it, but because they've learned not to. They learn to hold everything inside. They learn to become convincing. After George's death, the world wanted explanations. People rushed to connect dots, to find causes, to turn a life into a narrative that made sense. Annie did not participate in that rush. She didn't offer details. She didn't share private memories. She didn't correct speculation. Her silence wasn't avoidance. It was restraint, because there was one memory she couldn't bring herself to examine publicly. Not because it was scandalous, but because it was painfully ordinary. No argument, no dramatic goodbye, no moment that could be framed as meaningful in hindsight. Just a pause, a delay, a decision to wait. In later interviews, Annie spoke about grief as something that evolves. At first, it's sharp, then it dulls, then it becomes something quieter, something that lives beneath your thoughts. She said grief doesn't always attach itself to the moment of loss. Sometimes it attaches itself to realization. The realization that something was misunderstood, that something was postponed, that something was left undone. She never said she felt responsible, but she spoke about responsibility differently after George, about how respect can sometimes look like distance, about how waiting can sometimes feel kind until there is no one left to wait for. Annie Lennox had spent decades turning emotion into clarity, but this wasn't something she could translate into music. There was no melody for it, no resolution, just an unfinished thought that returned when the world went quiet. She once described loss as the absence of possibility, not the absence of a person, but the absence of what could have still happened. That wasn't abstract, it was personal. Because the moment Annie Lennox could never forget wasn't dramatic, it wasn't public, it wasn't even clearly defined. It was the pause, the hesitation, the certainty that there would be time later, and she would eventually understand why that belief stayed with her. But not yet. For a long time, Annie Lennox avoided naming the moment, not because she didn't remember it clearly, but because naming it made it real. As long as it remained undefined, it stayed manageable. A feeling, a weight, an impression she could set aside when needed. But time has a way of removing those defenses, and eventually she allowed herself to look at it directly. The truth was quieter than anyone expected. There was no dramatic final exchange, no deep confession, no moment that felt like a goodbye. That was the problem. The moment she could never forget wasn't marked by finality. It was marked by normalcy. George had reached out, not in crisis, not with urgency, just enough to remind her he was there. And Annie had done what she had done countless times before. She paused. She assumed the conversation could wait. Later, she would admit that what unsettled her most wasn't the silence itself. It was how ordinary it felt, how easily it blended into the rhythm of life, how quickly it became just another moment postponed. She had no reason to believe it would be the last time. That assumption was the betrayal, not of him, but of the moment. When the news came, Annie didn't experience shock in the way people expect. There was grief, yes, but beneath it, something more specific, a realization that arrived fully formed, that the pause had been permanent. She didn't replay their entire history. She didn't search for hidden signs. She returned to that single decision, the one she hadn't questioned at the time, the one that felt reasonable, the one that couldn't be undone. Annie would later say that loss doesn't always come from distance. Sometimes it comes from proximity, from being close enough to assume continuity, from believing connection is durable simply because it has survived before. She had believed that with George. She had believed time was generous. What made the regret difficult wasn't that she had said the wrong thing. It was that she hadn't said anything at all. No reassurance, no check-in, no acknowledgement that maybe the silence mattered. Just the confidence that there would be another moment. Annie didn't describe this as guilt. She was careful with that word. She framed it as awareness, the awareness that respect can sometimes turn into distance, That restraint can become absence. That waiting can feel safe, until it isn't. She began to speak differently after that, not just about George, but about connection, about how easily people mistake composure for stability, how often they assume someone who appears controlled doesn't need intervention. She spoke about listening more closely to what isn't said. George Michael had mastered silence, but Annie came to understand that mastery doesn't equal comfort. Sometimes it's survival, and survival isn't the same as peace. She would later reflect that she hadn't lost George in a moment of chaos. She lost him in a moment of calm, in the quiet space between intention and action. That realization stayed with her. There was no dramatic last sentence to remember, no words to quote, just the absence of a conversation that never happened. And that absence proved heavier than any memory. Annie Lennox didn't speak publicly about this right away. She let years pass. She allowed the meaning to settle. And when she finally acknowledged it, she did so without drama, without blame, without accusation. She spoke about how easy it is to believe that silence means strength, how comforting it can be to trust that people will reach out when they need help, and how painful it is to realize that sometimes they don't. Not because they don't want to be heard, but because they've learned not to ask. The final moment she could never forget wasn't a moment of connection. It was a moment of assumption. The assumption that time would continue as it always had, that the opportunity to speak would return. That postponement didn't carry consequences. In the years since, Annie has described loss not as something that shouts, but as something that whispers. It reminds you of the moments you dismissed, the pauses you didn't question, the silences you trusted. She learned that unfinished conversations don't fade. They linger. They change how you listen. They change how quickly you respond. They make you less comfortable with delay. Annie Lennox would never say that one conversation could have changed everything. She was careful not to romanticize it. But she understood that presence matters, that choosing to engage, even briefly, carries weight. That waiting is not neutral. The reason she could never forget that final moment wasn't because it was tragic. It was because it was ordinary, because it could happen to anyone, because it does happen to everyone, quietly, without warning. And that is what stayed with her. Not the loss itself, but the lesson it left behind. That moments don't announce their importance. That silence is not always safe. That time is not as generous as it feels. Some conversations don't end. They simply stop, and we carry them with us, unfinished, for the rest of our lives. This is RetroWaves,